So yeah, in ZBrush, I mentioned this before actually, you guys can go into Lightbox. And so Lightbox basically gives you tools and projects. So tools you can actually access over here by going into load, which will allow you to load a previously stored project and save. Sorry, I should say Z tool specifically. So if I go to load, I'm going to show you just some old like conceptual stuff that I've done. Right? And if you do a save as, oops, sorry. Do a save as, then you can save a new version. And I do it manually by numbering it. And I always number things, like roughly every half hour I would go in and make a new version. This way you don't lose any work. By the way, this palette over here, so some people get a little confused by this, but this is basically like your most recently opened files. So as you open new projects, start new projects, load new tools, so if I switch to another, like let's say the ring, for example, you see that now expands this palette, which is great. So when you save a file, it's only saving the current, a ZTL file. If you go to save as ZTL, it's going to save the current active tool, which is in the larger box of that palette. Another thing to be aware of, if you don't have a ton of RAM on your computer and it gets really slow, if you're loading heavy projects and they stay in the memory, like my Terminator prototype that I started and never finished. So yeah, if you load a bunch of tools and they stay in the this sort of palette or most recently accessed palette file, it can slow down your system quite a bit, so you may have to just reset. But if you hit this little R button, the reset button will wipe out everything else that's kind of stored in memory or in RAM, and then just leave you with that tool. So you want to make sure you do any save as before. Usually I don't find I have to reset this too often, because either you'll save and close ZBrush or it'll just crash on you and you'll just reload it. So yeah, that's sort of a basics about the tool. Now if you do go to File, Save As, this is the ZBrush project. So again, I think I brought this up last class, but it's important to remember is that this will save virtually every setting throughout the software, and by default this undo history is on, and ZBrush has unlimited history, unlimited undos. So you could have thousands and thousands of actions stored in your file, which can make it very, very heavy and very slow. It's one of the main reasons I don't, even though I can turn this off, I don't use this. Also, if you have a bunch of tools stored in the palette here, that actually gets saved off in the document, which is through File. Sorry, Project. Document is another thing. If you do a save as, and I've seen people do this at the beginning, they do a save as, it actually warns you and says, do you want to save the document or the actual tool, which is the thing you're sculpting on? If you save the document, if you just kind of click it without thinking about it, you're literally only getting a 2D snapshot. You're not saving the model at all. So then you go back to open it, and you're like, well, why can't I move it? Well, technically, if I go Document, Save As, Save Document, since I don't care about this file, I'll save it to the desktop, which is always dangerous. But now if you rotate the model around, you see what's happening is it left that snapshot on the canvas. So you're technically not saving the model. You're just saving a screenshot. The document is the document space is basically the viewport inside of ZBrush. So you want to be careful of that. Like I said, I hardly ever use projects. I do save out documents for concepts. So if I want to do a character turntable or a character sheet, then I'll create snapshots, which you can do actually by moving your model somewhere like here, hitting Shift S, moving to the side, Shift S, right? So then you can kind of like, show this off to clients or whatever, right? So then in that case you could say save as, or if you export, it'll actually export to a common image format like JPEG, PSD, PNG, and so on. So, and if you want to get back to sculpting, well, you just hit Control N, which is the shortcut for new canvas. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the document versus project versus file or ZTL. I pretty much always recommend ZTL since it stores virtually everything about the project except for maybe I think enhanced rendering and lighting. Some lighting information is saved in the ZTL, but everything is saved in the project file. So I personally prefer ZTLs for the most part. Okay, so let's go back to a sphere. Now, I do want to mention a little difference here as well. So if you go into the project panel, there are some spheres here, and these are a little bit different than the pre-built 3D meshes here. You may have heard me mention before, but I said that Zbrush started as a really cheesy 2D/3D, what they call 2.5D drawing software. And these are all the brushes for that. So the common one here is this, and it'll tell you, do you want to switch into this kind of drawing mode, right? So this is sort of like, it's a terrible brush stroke, but so this is like the simple brush, and we can put an alpha on this, and it actually will raise the stroke. If you hold Alt, it'll subtract the stroke with some depth, but there's not really true 3D access in here, right? It's only when we drag out a piece of mesh and go to edit it that we can move the model around. So you have to hit T to get that into edit mode. And like I said, there's a little key difference. In the project menu, there's something called Dynamesh, right? So Dynamesh is a special mode that's been activated. And you can see the mesh isn't as clean. There's lots of little triangles and stuff. And that allows you to sort of pull the model around. So if I grab, let's say, the move brush and really pull it out, and you see once I reach the limits of this, it starts to really spread out. But because if I go into Geometry, Dynamesh, this button is on. If I control, click, and drag, it just gives me a new mesh. So right away, it's sort of like editable. You can keep adding mesh as you go. It's a little bit chaotic, so it doesn't give you clean mesh. But if you know you want to do something more mechanical and start more cleanly, it's very typical to actually just go into the 3D meshes instead. Okay. So for that, we would go to either sphere or cube. So let's go to sphere, right? And technically, if I try to draw on this, it's actually going to say, you know, warning, to enable sculpting, convert this 3D primitive to a polymesh 3D. So there is a button up here in the upper right hand of ZBrush. So if you start with a mesh like this, you can go make polymesh 3D to start sculpting. Before I do that, though, I do want to mention why this is important. So like I said, if you're planning on something, you know you're going to have a very kind of clean and structured base, and it's not going to be as organic or chaotic as, you know, some sort of creature or character model. We can use the initialize panel. So this is sort of like in Maya when you go into the first initial settings of a cube, a sphere, a torus, or whatever, and you can say, you know what, I want this to be shorter on this axis or shorter on this axis. I want to have less divisions through the mesh, so I can have less this way. I want half a sphere, so maybe I want less coverage, like so, right? So we get a little bit more kind of clean mechanical control over our mesh through the initialize. Now again, it's still not sculptable. So when I'm ready, I would say click on Make Polymesh 3D up here, right? So click on that, and now it should be sculptable and editable with the common brushes, okay? Yeah. Import a mesh or load a tool. It's already a Polymesh 3D. It's only for the pre-built primitives. The main reason is that these things are driven by kind of a mathematical formula, so you can adjust like how many turns in this coil, for example, right? You can adjust how many divisions, or how smooth it is. So this is all driven by math, and you have to kind of tell ZBrush, okay, make it a sculptable soft piece of mesh now, right? So now we can kind of pull things, warp them, right? So that's sort of saying, okay, we're done initializing or setting up the initial shape and number of polygons that we have. We want to get into sculpting. Whereas if you load a tool, it's already assumed that you've made a polymesh. You're sculpting something, right? Or if you import an OBJ, you've already built that base somewhere else, so it doesn't have access to those mathematical dials.
And where are all those math dials, by the way?
Yeah, you basically, once you load any of the preset 3D meshes, by the way, if you want to hide the 2D tools, which I often do, you can just say auto hide tools, and then when you go in here, it's a much cleaner kind of menu. So let's say I go to 3D sphere. It's under initialize. So it's the second menu from the bottom, and then you get access to, again, the sort of scaling, the polygon count here, okay? So you can control how many. So if I need to put, let's say, 1,000 bolts onto a machine, and I know I don't have the poly count to load them all into memory and or make them super high res or detailed, then that, you know, that's when I would say, okay, I'm going to make this like 8 polygons, 8 divisions by 8 divisions. So it's super blocky, low poly, you know, and then I could hide off the top or the bottom half by holding Control Shift, right? And then that would be one of the bolts that would go into my machine, okay? So that's kind of the idea behind that, is that when you're building something, you want to plan a little bit ahead. So I'm back here just with the Dynamesh sphere. So, you know, for me, it doesn't really matter to show these tools. I kind of want to show you 2 different types of deformations that we can do inside of ZBrush. So we obviously have the brush manipulation, So this is a Dynamesh sphere, and we can manipulate this just by... Sorry, my software, by the way, I've got this little mouse software. I'm going to have to probably close it because it's being a little goofy. Yeah, it should show my keyboard shortcuts, but sometimes they stay on screen longer than they should. Anyways, so in here, right, we can obviously manipulate directly through sculpting using the move brush, the standard brush, the smoothing, you know, maybe masking and things like that. But one of the really, really powerful things in ZBrush is deformations, and this is common in a lot of 3D software. So just to kind of go through the major ones, there's something called the offset, which actually offsets this thing from its pivot. So if I hit W, E, or R, which is the move, scale, rotate tool, it activates the gizmo. So if you take a look, if I hit X, I can see my symmetry, but I'm actually, you know, because my pivot is off center, because I did an offset on X, I'm not getting symmetrical sculpting. So if this ever happens, let's say you move a tool off of its center by accident, you can go to the transform menu and then go into into set pivot. So when you click that, it'll actually recenter the pivot to the center of that mesh. So I don't really often use offset, and offset is almost the same thing as just grabbing the tool and moving it. So it's pulling it off of its pivot. So offset, I don't find it particularly useful, but I'm sure there's some cases where it can be. If I hit Shift F so we can see the wireframe and I do a rotate, well, now we can rotate this thing as well. And it's actually kind of rotating the object without necessarily rotating the... Right, if I go here and rotate, it's a little weird in symmetry, right? I can kind of break it in a strange way. If I turn off symmetry by hitting X, now we can rotate the sphere. And this is a little different here. It's rotating from the world center, which is at the bottom of the sphere, not the center. So a couple different options there. We can also resize this just by scaling through here. Again, my preference is just to go right into the scale tool. We've got bend. So right now, again, we won't see much in the way of bending, so I may just elongate this thing so we can see what happens when we bend this. Right? So it's sort of bending along one axis. It's like a sharp angled bend, which looks a little weird, right? So if I use the spherical bend, well, now I get something a little more appealing. So if you want to make like a tooth or something, that might be kind of an interesting way to do it, is to maybe go in, I'll hit B for brush, S for snake hook, and then I'll use the first snake hook. Let's say pull this straight up, and then we could try a spherical bend, right? Very quickly we can get a fang, a claw, a tooth of some kind. So it's really amazing what you can do with just a few basic deformers. So, and by the way, you can change the axis of where that's applied. So you can, it's a tiny, tiny little option, but you see there's a tiny little XYZ. ZBrush is both great and terrible, and I think this is one of the bad parts of ZBrush, is that it's got tiny little options on tiny little sliders and buttons. So you can switch this to, let's say, the Y-axis instead, and it's going to sort of skew off in a different direction, or let's say X. So it's going to bend over this way. So that gives me another interesting result. And you could also turn on more than one axis at the same time. So you get kind of a skewing and twisting into another axis. So let's say I try to do that snake hook thing again. Okay, and then I'll do the double spherical bend, right? So you can get twisting horns this way, like ram horns. Certain kind of antelopes have kind of a twisted horn. So this is a very quick and easy way to do that. We got flatten, so you can actually, it does a sort of a spherical or what's called a radial flatten. And by the way, if you want to know what they do specifically, if you hold control and hover over any of these things or any function in ZBrush, it will roughly tell you exactly what the tool is doing and give you some direction as to how it's being used. There's just a plain flatten, so you can actually flatten to one side. So if you want to make like an amulet or something, you can say, oh, I'm going to flatten this to one side. And of course, if you go negative, it flattens from another direction. Sorry, this way, negative or positive. And of course, we can do it from top to bottom, left to right, front to back, right? And it's literally just flattening that stuff against itself. We've got twist. So again, and you can apply it multiple times. So that's on the Z. This is on the Y. Right? So you can make complex flower petals. You can do all sorts of stuff with this, right? Or you know, start experimenting and make sort of sea crustaceans and things like that. So yeah, ZBrush gets pretty crazy sometimes. And we've got taper. So let me undo that. So if we have a taper, it'll kind of pull things down to one. Again, it's depending on the axes that are activated. So let's say I just do this on the Y. It'll taper to one point. So if you want like a teardrop shape, that's pretty good for that. We've got squeeze. So squeeze will sort of bulge in and bulge out depending on what axes are activated. Again, you get different options. So these, I think, in the middle are fairly useful. There's some additional ones like noise, which kind of adds a surface roughness. I mean, I personally haven't found a great use for that yet, but so let's say you did a surface noise and you wanted to smooth it. Well, I can smooth it by shift clicking and dragging and doing it by hand, or I could actually use the smooth slider, which actually is like taking the smooth brush equally to all surfaces of the mesh. So sometimes that's actually very useful as well, is to sort of just use the slider versus the brush. So a lot of these sliders are or have a related brush. Not all of them, but we do have flatten brushes. We do have you know, a smoothing brush, of course. We have an inflate brush. So inflate will actually take existing shapes. If you take it negative, it'll actually suck things in and make it actually almost a little bit sharper. So sometimes they use that as a technique to just do a negative inflate of maybe 1 or 2, and it sort of enhances or sharpens detail. And if you inflate, you get this kind of creepy bulging look to your mesh. And so that can create a whole new texture, right? And then maybe I'll smooth that out using the slider, you know? So now I've got sort of an alien egg effect. So when you chain these things together, right, you can make so much more complex and interesting things. So there's inflate balloon, which actually does a more exaggerated version of this. And then we've got spherify, which will take something and literally try to turn it right into a sphere. So that could be practically anything. A cylinder. Let me just make polymesh so I can actually edit it with a deformer menu. Spherify, okay? So again, I haven't found too much use for spherify. Gravity will try to make things look like it's melting towards the bottom of that world axis. So sometimes that can be useful if you want to create drips and drops and blobs of things. And perspective, I guess it's I'm not really sure. I've never used this one either, but I think it's sort of exaggerating the perspective of the view. Again, I'm not really sure what you would use that for, but maybe if you're just experimenting, you can play around with that. Okay, so if you guys want, let's grab a sphere. Not a Dynamesh sphere, just one of the pre-made 3D spheres. Your sphere, you just want to make sure we click on Make Polymesh 3D. And if you have the Polyframe or the Wireframe on, which is Shift F, or if we click on this button down here, I find I often like to work with this, kind of flicking it off and on, so I can sort of see what's happening with the model. So Shift F is the shortcut again. If you grab the move tool, the Gizmo, which is W, E, or R, either one of those shortcuts works. Just a few things about the Gizmo. You can move its pivot off center, so you can rotate from a different pivot. If you hold Alt and click on a surface, it actually will point off of the surface in the direction that the polygons are facing, which can be useful. So if you want to scale in this direction, let's say, you can do that. If you hold, so anytime you hold Alt, it basically allows you to freely move the pivot around. It's kind of like hitting the D key inside of Maya. If you want to reset the orientation of the world, you hold Alt and click on Reset. If you want to center it to the object, you click on Alt and click on the little house icon, which goes kind of to the center of the object. If you have a masked area like this and you hold Alt, it should go to the unmasked center. So let's say actually I mask the top half and go Alt click. It's going to the center of the unmasked portion of the model. And then again, of course, if I Alt click on the home, it just sort of resets everything. I never used the sticky mode. I haven't really explored that in depth. But the main thing I want to show you guys, this Gizmo. One of these hidden, super powerful kits is in this gear icon on the Gizmo. So when you're in that move tool, W, E, or R, click on the Gizmo, and we've got a bunch of deformers buried in here as well. So let's take a look. I'll have you guys start with Extender. Pretty fun one. Extender. Okay. This thing is crazy. It looks insane, right? So what is it? Well, you've got options for the XYZ. So that's red, green, blue. Almost always in 3D software, red, green, blue, XYZ, UVW for textures. And red, green, blue is X, Y, Z. And these are symmetry options in here. This is something called extender. So what does it do? It literally allows you to just kind of extrude through the middle, extrude through the height. And I believe, do I have the depth yet? Extrude through the depth.
Sir, which tool was that?
So I'll go back just so you guys can see this. So what I did is I activated the Gizmo, the 3D Gizmo, which is W, E, or R. Click on Customize, and it's a little tool in here called Extender. Okay. So these deformers, they're somewhat similar to the sliders on the right side, but the main difference with this is that you can get in and control things more directly, whereas those sliders are sort of based on the pivot or the object's position in the world, and they don't always deform in the ways that you expect them to. But this is really cool. So what it does is allows you to say, okay, I'm going to extrude or extend out on the X. Technically, I think that's the Y. This is the X, and then on the Z. Okay, let me just switch my material so it's a bit easier to sort of see the wireframe. So the original sphere is still there. It's just that we basically kind of done some sort of extrusions. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is you see the little white cones outside of the orange ones actually allow you to scale that one extension up or down. So if you left click and drag it, you can extend it in or out. Right? Pretty crazy stuff. So maybe you want to start a spaceship like this, right? Anyways, yeah. And there's other options here, right? So we can actually have, if we grab, you can sort of see it pops up a little instruction. For the Y symmetry, you can have it be parallel or have it mirror on both sides, depending on how you set that up. We can inflate as well. So that's the little white cone over here. So if you inflate this, you can make this, that entire new area in between where the sphere was, something that pops in or pops out. So you can start to build like sci-fi crates and things like that with this. Right? And we also have this is a creasing option. I'll talk a little bit about creasing later on. And then we can also, I believe, where is it? The size, not the size. I want to affect the poly count or the resolution. So yeah, it's on the XYZ. So you can actually increase the number of polys that happen in between the extension, essentially. Okay, so we can have more divisions on the side. I usually like to have a roughly equal amount of polys depending on what I'm doing. Right? So that's the extender. Now, this tool is sort of still in a live edit mode, and you can see that because the gear is still here. All these little tools are still here. And by the way, as a weird bonus, that little blue dot is in the center of the original sphere. You can left click and drag it to do other really weird and unusual things. So if you wanted, you know, maybe some sort of like super high-tech sci-fi like tablet scroll thing, you could maybe move that off to the side, or I don't know, experiment around with it a bit, right? Now if I want to apply this, I have to click on the gear, hit accept, and then we're back to our plain gizmo. Okay. So I'm not going to go through all these. You know, I'm actually pretty new to using these tools, but I do find them pretty interesting. There is things like the bend arc. Again, a little bit goofy, but you can do things like twist. So I'll go back to show you that. Under the gear, there's bend arc, bend curve, bevel. So let's say I go to bend arc. We can control the angle of bend. So, you know, I could actually extrude that around basically, or bend that around into some really unusual shape if I wanted to. So I think what's kind of fun about this is that, you know, you can really just play around. And if you wanted to have a sort of sharp angle and snap, you can hold shift as you pull it out so it stays kind of nice and sort of flat in a way. Or you can more freeform this around if you like. You can twist as you go. So there's another twist option here. So again, we can sort of bend and warp this shape in all sorts of ways, right? And we can sort of twist it through that deformation. So I'm just going to reset that, and you can also go back into the gear icon. If you're not happy with it, you can say, okay, I'm going to delete that bend. There's bend curve, so this one kind of gives you like 2 points, which you can kind of curve through. There, we can sort of scale it through that. We can warp it. And again, I'll just delete that and go back to the gear icon. Bevel, kind of interesting. What it does is it sort of will find a certain range in which it will try to bevel certain edges, and I believe it's a bit hard to see, I guess. Let me just turn this display off for a second. So you can sort of set what crease angle. That basically means like what amount of, like what is within the range that's going to be beveled. So try to bevel everything on the object. Okay. So if, you know, maybe I want to make a keypad of some kind on this thing. All right, then I have a bunch of these little white squares I could then extrude out for something like that. So that, you know, these tools, like I said, I don't use them all the time, but they are pretty interesting for playing around with and experimenting with. And we've got deformers as well. So again, I'll sort of stick to that. Inflate is very similar to the other inflate, so we can inflate to one side, right? Also inflate to something like this. So they're similar, but they offer maybe a little bit more direct hand control. We also have things like slice, which is pretty cool. So that allows you to put in basically a new edge to cut through the mesh. So you can just left click and drag this dot around. Another really interesting one is so deformers are basically like putting a cage around. So there's deformer, deformer hard, and deformer soft. Deformer hard, if you control, click and drag across and mask some, it allows you to actually warp whichever points you leave essentially unmasked. So that can be very useful for just modifying a broader shape and getting something that would be a little bit harder to do just by grabbing things with a brush. Okay. My offers the same thing. I think it's called a lattice. 3D Max is something very similar, which is called, I believe, a FFD, which is a free-form deformer. So deformer soft, it actually controls things in a very, so I have to, again, mask some of these points to get access to them. So maybe I want a rounded top. Well, I could do that with this deformer, okay? If I use the other one instead, let's say I delete that and use the hard deformer, and again, I'll just Control, Alt, click and drag to unmask these points. You see you get a much sharper ridge there. So that's a key difference, whether it's got kind of a soft effect or a hard effect. One other one I found pretty interesting is, where is it called? Slice? Flatten. Flatten is pretty interesting. So what you can do is actually further enhance this shape by pulling the flatten in. So you can get nice kind of hard edges on the side of some mechanical shape. Now again, it's just sort of flattening the mesh against itself, so it's not necessarily totally clean, but it is pretty interesting. And like I said, you do have mirroring options, so if I want this exactly the same on top and bottom, left and right, if you grab these cones and drag it up to mirror, so mirror, 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 it'll be exactly the same on both sides. So it's nice and symmetrical. And again, to apply it, I click on the gear, hit accept.